Hello and welcome to the Lydia McGrew channel. I am going to continue today talking about the evidential value of casualness. And today I'm going to apply that to an external incidental confirmation of one of the Gospels, kind of similar to the way that casualness is relevant to an undesigned coincidence. In fact, you can even refer to certain incidental external confirmations as undesigned coincidences. I usually reserve that word for, or that phrase for cross connections between books in the canon. But the structure is often much the same, as we'll see today. So the incidental connection I'm going to be talking about today concerns the book of Matthew, and it specifically concerns a portion of Matthew that comes under a lot of extra doubt and scrutiny, namely his infancy story. You'll remember that in Matthew it tells about how Joseph was warned to take Jesus and his mother and flee into Egypt because Herod the Great was going to try to kill him. And Herod then kills all of the babies in Bethlehem. And then, after Herod the Great dies, Joseph again receives a message from an angel telling him that Herod is dead, and he returns to Israel from Egypt. So this little bit comes right at the end of that. So this is Matthew 2:21 and following. And he arose and took the child and his mother and came into the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And being warned by God in a dream, he departed for the regions of Galilee, and came and resided in a city called Nazareth, that what was spoken through the prophets might be fulfilled, he shall be called a Nazarene. Now, it's very easy to move right past the mention of Archelaus there reigning in this place of his father Herod the Great, and go straight to that oddity about the prophet, he shall be called a Nazarene, and what Old Testament prophecy is that referring to there, and this is a slightly odd quotation, and so on. We just move right on to Matthew's theological interest in prophecy. But I'm going to suggest we not do that. I'm going to suggest that we pause and think about the statement that Joseph was afraid when he heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea. Archelaus was just one of the sons of Herod the Great. He had other sons, and one of them, Herod Antipas, was given the tetrarchy that included Galilee. So Joseph was going and settling under the rule of a different son of Herod the Great. And this could raise a question. Why specifically was he afraid to settle under Archelaus and preferred to settle in a region that was ruled by a different son of Herod the Great? It can't just be that he's afraid of the son of Herod the Great. So what's different about Archelaus? Matthew makes no attempt to explain that. He doesn't tell us why. He doesn't even show whether he himself knew why. He may have or he may not have. And that's where we're going to be getting to the evidential value of casualness. Now, there is actually external evidence that can give us a clue as to the reason. We get this from Josephus. Josephus tells us that after Herod the Great died, there were protests going on in the precincts of the temple over something that Herod the Great had done. I'm not even going to go into what it was that Herod the Great had done that made the people angry, but they were protesting. Archelaus had not yet formally been given the rule over Judea, but it was expected that he would be. And so he immediately took authority because, there was need for someone to take authority. And he tried to stop these protests, but they didn't stop. And in fact, some soldiers actually got stoned by the Jewish protesters in the temple precincts. This was right around Passover time. And at that point, Archelaus sent mounted soldiers into the temple, and they killed a bunch of Jews in the temple precincts, just slaughtered them. And then he sent messengers out, sort of criers, to proclaim the news far and wide that Passover was just going to be canceled that year. There just wasn't going to be a Passover. The political situation was too delicate. And later, Archelaus actually got into trouble for this because a complaint was made to Caesar that he had overreacted, that he had acted with too much violence and so forth and gone beyond his authority. Now, we can well imagine Joseph's coming back shortly after this happened. It would be fresh in people's mind. There's no internet to keep this, fresh in people's mind for hundreds of years or even for decades. But if he came back right away after Herod the Great died, it would be in the forefront of people's mind. And he returns. Originally, it seems that he was intending to go back to Bethlehem, or at least to Judea, to that region. I think it's very likely that Joseph had family in Bethlehem. That's a conjecture, but I think it's very plausible. And so he was going to go back there. But then he heard that Archelaus was reigning, and it says he was afraid. It also says he was warned by God in a dream, just in case he didn't, get the point, and went and settled instead in Galilee, which then, and in Nazareth, which Matthew says fulfilled prophecy. You can imagine that if he heard that this particular son of Herod the Great had just done this violent thing, had killed all of these Jews in the temple precincts, and had canceled Passover, he would be thinking, I don't need that kind of trouble. And it's not as though Herod Antipas is portrayed particularly positively in the book of Matthew. He's the one who beheads John the Baptist. But at least at this point, he hadn't engaged in some kind of act of mass violence, which was something you can imagine that Joseph felt he didn't want to get involved with, especially with this child who had been said to be the king of the Jews. So I think that can provide a plausible explanation of the statement that Joseph was afraid when he heard that Archelaus was reigning in his father's place. Now, a skeptic who does not want to accept that as a confirmation of the flight to Egypt, which is a unique part of Matthew's infancy story, can take a couple of different routes. One route would be to just say that there is no connection with Archelaus canceling Passover, that it's just a bald, bare coincidence. And sometimes skeptics, and unfortunately even some Bible scholars who are not skeptics, will take that coincidence route. On this channel, we've talked before about the attempt to kind of brush under the rug the connection between the green grass in the book of Mark and the time of Passover mentioned in the book of John for the feeding of the 5,000. The statement being made that, Mark just put that in there, he made that up to fit with Psalm 23, because Jesus has compassion on the multitude, that they're as sheep not having a shepherd, and so, he makes me to lie down in green pastures. So Mark made that up. Notice that doesn't explain the connection with Passover. That just leaves, it doesn't explain away the undesigned coincidence. It does nothing with the undesigned coincidence. It just leaves it as a bare coincidence. And someone could do that here. They could say, well, Matthew just made up the whole story about the flight to Egypt, and as part of it, he needs to get Jesus to Nazareth because Jesus was known as Jesus of Nazareth. Everybody knew he was from Nazareth, but he had him born in Bethlehem to fulfill prophecy. So now he needs to get him to Nazareth, and he also thinks that fulfills prophecy. So he made up this fear that Joseph has to make an excuse for him to go to Nazareth. But notice that leaves the connection between Archelaus and what Archelaus had done and Joseph's fear unexplained. It's just a bald coincidence. And what we're kind of doing, it's kind of a misdirection. It's like a magician that hey, look over here, and then with his other hand he's doing something else that he doesn't want you to look at. And so it's drawing attention to Matthew's supposed theological agenda and using that to quote unquote explain the mention of Archelaus and just leaving it unexplained that we actually know something separate from Josephus about Archelaus, that would seem to make this a very plausible thing to happen, that Joseph might have really been afraid. So that's not very satisfactory. So if you wanted to be a little more canny, you might try a different kind of model. So this is an invention model. Here we go again with one of my really, really cool super pro diagrams, an invention model. So in this invention model, you do have a fact, which is that Archelaus did cancel Passover. That's from Josephus. You'll notice that skeptics are a lot less skeptical about Josephus than they are about the Gospels. So take that to be a fact, which I'm taking to be a fact as well. And then this is a line of information, as we've said in other cases. This is a line of information. So Matthew supposedly knows this fact. Somehow he hears it. I don't know of a skeptic who's argued that he got it from Josephus. Maybe he got it from somewhere else, but somehow Matthew knows it. And so then the idea is that Matthew invents Joseph's fear, okay, to go with the fact about Archelaus. You can think of this as a kind of a hoax model, where the hoax is a little bit like a historical novel. So the idea is that you take a fact that you know, a real fact, and then you connect something in a story that you're just making up to that real fact, because it makes your made-up story look more probable. And it's not really a historical novel model, because Matthew's not presenting what he's doing as fiction. Historical novels are presented as fiction. You know, they're not trying to hoax anybody. So it would be like a novel-like hoax would be the idea. Now, there's a lot to be said against that. The most prominent thing is that realistic historical novels of this kind did not exist at the time. I'm not saying there was no fiction. I'm not saying there was no fiction that mentioned some real places or, you know, a real king here or there. But this kind of thing where you're bringing in these little incidental things and you're connecting them up with your novel in a highly realistic way, that was just not even an existing genre. And it's hyper complex. This idea of, you know, Matthew just sort of inventing that. So it's not a thing that commends itself. It's not a theory that commends itself very well. But at least it makes an attempt to explain the connection with Archelaus, because the idea is that Matthew is actually designing that connection with Archelaus. It's not like it's just a bald coincidence. It's that Matthew is deliberately inventing the fear or scruple that Joseph had in order to connect it with a real fact that Archelaus had canceled Passover. Now, this is where casualness comes in. I want to emphasize, I'm not saying that if a author reports something in a non-casual way and he explains the connection, that means it's untrue. These things are probabilistic and they're subtle. What I do mean is that there is an extra mark here of verisimilitude that refutes that kind of hoax novel theory. So sometimes the way that a piece of evidence works is that it refutes a particular alternative hypothesis. So there's some particular alternative hypothesis that someone's bringing up and you're saying, you know, that's just not a starter. That's a non-starter because of this, okay? And that hoax novel theory is really poor. It's really a non-starter here specifically because of Matthew's casualness. I read a lot of historical novels. I love historical novels. An author that I think I've mentioned on this channel before, if you like historical fiction, give it a try, is Edith Pargeter, who also writes under the name of Alice Peters. She wrote the very popular mystery novels, the Cat File novels, but she also has a bunch of non-mysteries centered in Wales and Shrewsbury and the places near there in England. And she has this quartet of novels called The Brothers of Gwynedd. Really, really well done. Very sad, however, so if you don't like sad novels, you might not want to read them. But she does it in the first person, and the narrator is a fictional character who is sort of speaking as a chronicler, as if he's a chronicler of the things that happened to the princes of Gwynedd. And you'll notice when you read that, and when Samson, the narrator, brings something up, he will pause to explain it. It's really very well done. So if he gives an unusual name for a given Lord of Wales, he'll pause and he'll say, for this man was married to an English woman, and he wished to be identified with the English, so he took to himself the name of de la Pole after the fashion of the English. So he's going to go into this explanation. And that person is real. I mean, you can look it up. You can find out that person existed. Of course, Pargeter was writing in an era where there were plenty of reference works and so forth that she could look up. She could easily get a hold of that information and fold it in. The historical novel was a very well-known, very well-established genre. But she gives this explanation because that gives her novel even more of a feeling of a chronicle, like something that a chronicler would write. So these things tend to be explained. They don't just go by. And the person, especially if the person is doing a hoax, so that he's actually trying to make you think that he's telling a real story that he actually made up, it's unlikely that he would just take a chance. Now, at this point, when you do things like this, you often find that those who want to explain away stuff like this, they'll go, well, common knowledge. It's one of their favorite phrases. It was common knowledge. You can't be sure of that at all. And if you're faking a story and you're dragging in this fear of Archelaus to make your fake story seem more real to your readers, why would you take a chance? By the time Matthew is writing, it's quite possible that it would not be common knowledge and that many of his readers might miss it. In fact, many readers since then have missed this connection to Archelaus. And it would have been very easy. He could have said, Joseph heard that Archelaus was reigning in his father's place, and he was afraid to settle in Judea, for Archelaus had shed blood in the temple at the time of Passover. And so he removed and went to Galilee, to the city of Nazareth. Simple, very short, okay? And if he had done that, that wouldn't necessarily mean he was making it up at all. Not at all. But it would be more likely that he would give at least some kind of brief connection to the fact that he's bringing in to a fake story to make the fake story seem real, than that he would just mention Archelaus in this unexplained fashion. In fact, you can't even tell from that whether Matthew himself knew why Joseph was afraid of Archelaus. Maybe he did, and maybe he didn't, but you can't tell. He's certainly taking no trouble to make the connection clear, and that's casualness. That's the evidential value of casualness. So that refutes, I believe, quite strongly the hoax novel theory, and I believe it confirms reportage for this return from Egypt. And here you have the fact: Archelaus cancels Passover. You have a line of information going over here, but it's to another fact that Joseph was genuinely afraid when he heard that. And then Matthew, who may or may not, you'll notice there's no information line here. We don't know whether Matthew knew about Archelaus canceling Passover, but that Matthew has information about Joseph's fear, and he just reports Joseph's fear truthfully. And then that's why Joseph's fear connects with what we know independently of Archelaus from Josephus. And I think that's a much better model of the reason for that connection, and casualness helps us to see why. I want to mention my latest book, Testimonies to the Truth, is now out. It came out a couple of weeks early. So head on over to Amazon and get yourself a copy. We're hoping that Amazon will continue to get its stocks in so it doesn't go out of stock at its warehouses. And we're hoping that this will be widely used. It's got questions, it's got suggested answers. It's really supposed to be quite user friendly. So please pick up a copy of Testimonies to the Truth, and I'll see if I can make a bit of a trailer for that. It may not be very polished. Before we move on, I think next time I may talk about the value of casualness in relation to an external confirmation of the Gospel of John. But I may do a trailer for Testimonies to the Truth first. So be sure to come back next time here to the Lydia Midrood channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.